So does anybody know what the fossils are up there right now? No, it's
Someone more
not
important.
a dinosaur.
Some sort of preliminary time, like.
Right. And it's the official state fossil in Wisconsin. So fossils are actually a real big part of our culture. You might not think so, but there's a lot of things going on with fossils and how it relates to science and the culture, things that you don't necessarily think about. Turns out they're pretty important for a variety of reasons. But few people understand where fossils come from, how they're studied, and things like that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. If you look around, you'll find things like dioramas in museums that show reconstructions of prehistoric life. This is one of the most important ones, one of my favorite, was one that I worked on, of course. But it shows you what an ancient reef about 420 million years ago looked like in recede. So, but you can find a lot of museums have exhibits of dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals and fossils. It's a very popular aspect of museums and generates a lot of money. So a lot of natural history museums really make a big effort to exhibit dinosaurs and things of that nature. World's fairs and other types of celebrations, like today, I guess, Dino Daze here. People highlight things like dinosaurs, prehistoric animals. It attracts a lot of attention. A lot of our parks, federal, state, and local parks, in this country and other countries, feature fossils, prehistoric animals. This is Dinosaur National Monument in Utah. They show up on the front page of newspapers fairly often. Stories about dinosaurs and human evolution, things of that nature, to a surprising degree. But the only thing that shows up more often is the space program and things about astronomy and things like that. But actually, prehistoric animals show up fairly often on the front page of newspapers. There are also various types of magazines which highlight that. News magazines, again, big stories show up fairly often. And then there are specific scientific directed magazines which also cover these sorts of notes and stuff about the dinosaurs, new discoveries, new ideas. They really show up in a lot of strange places in our culture. Everybody remembers Barney, and everybody like to see that happen to Barney, and don't even think, little kids like that. And there's Bart Simpson with a trilobite. So much for Lisa, she didn't show a trilobite. Well, it's her trilobite actually, but she didn't show a cartoon, but her holding. They show up at amusement parks and stuff. Here's one of the best, most complete Tyrannosaurus Rex artificial skeletons that exist anywhere. It's in Disney World, where they're painting. And prehistoric animals are used to sell things on a vast scale. If you don't think so, go around the next time you're in a grocery store and see how many things you can find with dinosaurs or something. Most of the stuff has absolutely nothing to do with prehistoric animals or evolution or time or anything like that. It's just a gimmick to sell things. But they're pretty popular. It works. It's been going on for decades. And of course, you can sell fossils too. Real fossils and fake fossils show up on the market fairly often. Heavily restored fossils. This is an example of dinosaur footprints down in Texas in the 1930s. They're chained down so somebody wouldn't walk away with them and steal them. They were workers at it. And you can find examples of prehistoric life just about anywhere. This is the former Red Mountain Museum in Birmingham, Alabama, which doesn't exist anymore. This is what the core of their laboratory was at the time. Next. There's a lot of misinformation. Godzilla is not a dinosaur. Okay, everybody realize that? And Flintstones are a very popular thing that promotes a lot of misinformation. Besides the fact that dinosaurs and people live together, there's no steering wheel in Fred's car, which makes it sort of non-functional. And so with all that, a lot of people have misconceptions about prehistoric life. in the history of life on this planet, and it can be disturbing to some people. So, few people understand where all these dinosaurs, prehistoric animals, where all these big fossils are, where they're found, who finds them, how they're found, how they're used scientifically. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, why fossils are important. You might have an interest in just, they're pretty objects, you want to collect them, you might want to collect stamps or something. But most of them are for fairly reasonable scientific reasons. There's some very prominent concepts in our culture that are derived from fossils. The great age of the earth is one of them. The succession of life through time is another one. And basic evolution and extinction are all important ideas. They're actually some of the most significant ideas that have ever developed in our culture. And they're fossil related. They're dependent on people collecting and studying fossils. Next. This is just a little example of geologic time. This is an illustration from the early 1800s showing the idea that there's succession of life through time. So you see all those little lines there. These lines here, those represent different time periods which have different types of fossils, so showing a succession of life through time. And they also show the changes in environments and things like that. So this was a really big deal. Before 1800, people sort of got an idea of what fossils were, that they're somehow related to animals and they died and buried. But it was only around 1800 where really the idea got going that they showed us something about time. They could tell us something about how vast the age of the earth is. So it's a pretty big deal. With the finding fossils, you can reconstruct environments like this. This was a 19th century reconstruction of a Jurassic Britain. Actually, it looks like it's mostly Cretaceous, or a combination there. Things like evolution show up very nicely and become well recognized. People understand a lot of concepts. Surprisingly, a lot of complex by the media and stuff like that. So here we see the evolution of the potato. And people understand that evolution is a real biologic feature. Some people don't believe it. But they do this through fossils and through the popularity of fossils showing up in media. Next. There's some other answers to big questions, why dinosaurs became extinct. And Ronald Reagan had nothing to do with killing them off, but the idea that the comets, that was a big thing that happened in the 80s, that people started to realize that there was some big events that killed off life at various times, and the end Cretaceous extinction event caused by a major meteor impact is one. So people have this idea that there's a lot of stuff going on in the fossil record, and it's true, not quite this complex. Not likely to see all this happening at once. Interesting, no? But there are some surprising things that a lot of people understand that they don't understand about other aspects of science, but they do understand things about ancient animals and stuff like dinosaurs have small brains and they were replaced by mammals and stuff like that. So these are ideas that actually, if you think about it, they're pretty specific to geology and paleontology and stuff of that nature, but the general public has a good understanding, or at least some understanding of these things. Another good example of geology in general being plate tectonics, which is the unifying theory of geology, and a lot of people have some notion at least what plate tectonics is. Concepts like, well, are dinosaurs birds? I mean, this is something a lot of people know. You ask people on the street, a lot of people know that there's at least a possibility, or there's some debate about this. And it's resolved again in products being sold. This tells you right here that dinosaurs are chickens. Chickens are dinosaurs. So you can learn some of the answers to these things in your local supermarket. But how are fossils discovered? The idea of people go out on big expeditions and dig holes in the ground and stuff like that is what a lot of people think goes on with dinosaurs, and it's not quite that simple. So who finds these things, where do they find them, why are they digging, how is it done? So this is a story that most people don't understand about paleontology and fossils, dinosaurs. Digging up fossils in the past might be a big event, finding a Mastodon skeleton in New York in the 1790s. Everybody from the neighborhood came out to see what was going on. They didn't necessarily understand what these bones represented, but it was something unusual, and so that attracted a lot of attention. But these things were found by accident. So they dig in a hole for a holocaust or something, and all of a sudden they find big bones, and people come and want to dig up more of them. In the late 1800s, you had more typical expeditions, or at least what people visualize as how dinosaurs are found. This is a Yale expedition led by O.C. Marsh, one of the famous dinosaur scientists of all time. It shows that he might have a lapse in judgment here, because it's all these students on this expedition are heavily armed, and he only has a hammer, so I'm not sure if that's the right way to present that kind of Next. Some of the pleasantries of collecting: mosquito nets replaced hammers and guns at some stage. It can be pretty miserable collecting fossils. But these are sort of organized types of expeditions that started in mostly the mid to late 1800s and continue on to And then there's famous people that collected fossils for commercial reasons. Mary Manning is one of them. She discovered some real important things. And from somebody who was not what you call well-educated in the middle of the 19th century, she actually was very skilled in understanding what her fossils were representing, sketching out bones and stuff like that, and things of that nature. She got very little credit for that because she wasn't great class in the British society at the time, but people recognize now she really knew what she was doing as just an amateur collector or a commercial collector. But there's other sort of collecting that's done today. There's still commercial collecting, still professional collecting. Amateur collecting has always been a driving force as soon as people had leisure time where they could collect fossils, class people in particular. People start to go out and make big fossil collections. And if you go to any museum today, if you look at the invertebrate fossils in particular, the vast majority of those are probably collected by local amateur collectors and not collected by professional scientists. Big things like vertebrates, dinosaurs, and mammoths, and that tends to still be collected more by professionals because it's a big and complex sort of job. But amateurs still probably pick up most of the fossils. One of my favorite examples here is Francis Tully and his monster. He discovered the Tully monster in the 1950s. Nobody knew what this animal was. They found thousands of them since then. But when they first found it, when he first found it, people called it Tully's monster, and when it was officially named, they called it Tully monstrum. So the official state fossil of Illinois is the Tully monster, very unique and not well understood animal. A lot of things get fossilized, everybody kind of gets this idea, and this shows what you have to kind of go through to find fossils. You have to have things dying, of course, and the vast majority of individuals that ever lived, and I mean the vast majority of them, are never become fossils. They just disappear and they're eaten or weathered away or something. A few fossils, a few animals and plants do get buried and preserved, and they have to become unburied so they can be studied by scientists. And of course, lots of them will go away before anybody sees them too. So it's a very straightforward kind of but complex situation. This just gives you an idea of what can all happen to something when it dies, and it's a whole bunch of things. So I'm not going into details, but you can either preserve very well, or more likely you're just going to disappear, whether you have hard parts or soft parts. So that's a big thing, fossilization. There's lots of animals living today, and plants to some extent, have no hard parts, so they have a very poor fossil record. Octopus, there's zillions of them living right now. Fossil octopi are extremely rare, and worms and things like that. Unless you have hard parts, you don't show up as fossils. A good example is sharks. Sharks' teeth are abundantly common throughout much of the world, but there's almost nothing else known. There's almost nothing else collected from sharks because it doesn't fossilize. They have cartilaginous skeletons, which don't preserve very well, and they have a lot of flesh and everything, so they disappear. So their teeth are everywhere, but what do these sharks look like? You can't be 100% sure a lot of times. Trilobites are the same. So this is again the visual state fossil in Wisconsin. Lots and lots of complete trilobites are found, but very few are preserved with legs. So there's like 20,000 species of trilobites, and there's maybe a dozen where they've actually found fossil legs, and that's because their legs, in contrast to a lot of living arthropods, are weakly mineralized, so they just don't preserve much at all. Very unusual to find. So what happens when something dies? A very nice iguana, lizard, and the Galapagos is laying there. What's going to happen to these bones? Well, it can be scavenged, of course, and just rot away. That's one of the more typical things. It can be just destroyed mechanically with wind erosion, water erosion, all kinds of things of that nature. And what's preserved can get altered by compression, for example. You're burying things, it's pushing down on them, squashing them, so it distorts them a little bit. But this is what we see in most museums, these beautifully reconstructed individuals. And it's not usually the way they're found. In fact, very few dinosaurs, for example, are known by complete specimens. In fact, most of them are something like 40% or so that are known even by substantial amounts of skeletons of a single individual. So it's not a common thing to find complete dinosaurs or any kind of big vertebrates, at least like that. And that's because of size. Small things can get buried easily, big things are much harder to bury in fossils. This is the most abundant dinosaur fossil in the world. This is a fragment of bone. This is what you usually find if you're out looking in beds where there are dinosaur fossils present. This pieces of bone, teeth or something. Individual bones, well-preserved ones, they can be more common. We have that nice leg bone in the back, which is from the Misinformation, as is this. This is Brachiosaurus. So individual bones are more typical. Then you can find the partially articulated things. Here's a whole leg of a Apatosaurus, most of them are quiet. But at least the bones are articulated. You find more parts of skeletons. This is even more typical. And then you can find things like this, which superficially is kind of jumbled up, and it's actually a very complete skeletal Tyrannosaurus from Canada. That's what it looks like when it's assembled. But you have to find these things and put them together. But finding a big animal, all the bones in place, is very unusual for most big vertebrates. Sauropod dinosaurs are some of the most commonly recognized dinosaurs in the world. Lots of people know about these things with long necks. This is one of the few, very, very few, that's ever been found where all the bones are pretty much in place. It's an articulated skeleton. So instead of big piles of random bones, this is an exception. And this is a juvenile. It's only about 18 feet long. And when they collected it, they didn't collect the ribs on one side. They were there, but they thought they were too poorly preserved to collect, which I don't think they do that now. The only bones missing are a few bones in the tail, weren't there originally. So ribs are there, but they didn't. So this comes into how you interpret these things. You're just finding a few individual bones, and if you want to go back to, say, the early 1800s, and nobody had a concept of things like dinosaurs and that, they had more of a concept of giants and dragons and things of that nature. You start finding these bones, and you're not finding whole articulated skeletons, you're just finding pieces of these things. How do you reconstruct them? In New Jersey, of all places, one of the big breakthroughs in reconstructing dinosaurs occurred. You can see that the skeleton there, Hadrosaurus. Not a lot of the skeletons there, but it shows something very important about dinosaurs. Previous to that, people were starting to think that they were pretty much just big lizards or four-legged lizards. But this shows that actually that some dinosaurs at least had long hind limbs and short front limbs. So that's where the idea of dinosaurs walking around standing up comes in. And it's just based on this. So in the 1850s, the skeleton was found, parts of it, and actually didn't found parts of it, were found much earlier, in New Jersey, which actually probably has a lot of dinosaurs in it, but not a lot of exposures to look for. And so this is the upright dinosaur idea that came from those bones. So what do you do when you have skeletons? If you have enough of the bones, you can try and put them together in some way that makes sense. So here's somebody reconstructing an iguanodon, which is something with short front legs and long hind legs, and they're trying to put it together. They're using birds, actually, as ostrich in particular, as a way of getting an idea how these bones all fit together. But that doesn't actually tell you how the animal moved around. It just gives you a basic idea of how the bones were connected. If you study the skeletons in detail, you can see where muscles attached, get a better idea of how they function. And then you have reproductions like this. So, three-legged dinosaur that walked around its hind legs. When I was a kid, it was also dragging its tail. Well, now I know that they didn't drag their tails. They actually walked like this. Tails is up balance one. So you see all these kinds of reproductions, and back, this is what they thought dinosaurs looked like in the 1900s, but a lot of that's changed based on more studies and finding more specimens and things of that nature. Sauropods are a real good example of this. This is Chicago World's Fair in the 1830s. A big Brontosaurus was featured in Exhibit Sarah at the time. Here's an individual bone, showing how big some of these bones are. Now this is a more typical fossils found of these big sauropods, big individual bones. And then we do have this complete skeleton. Okay. So, we know how it kind of looks, we know how the bones fit together, but people didn't necessarily believe what these animals were capable of doing. One of the big things was these sauropods are thought to be too big to actually walk on land. So they came up with in the early 1900s, they're still debating this, and they were looking at maybe they sort of drag their bellies along, tails like a lizard, a giant lizard. This is an example of how that would look. And here's a reconstruction of how that would look. When I was a kid, everyone thought that they lived in deep water and walked around and stuck their head out of the water and things of that nature, not realizing that the pressure of the water would probably interfere with their breathing if it was that deep. But this is one of the ways they could compensate for the idea that these animals are too big to walk on land. What they had all along, or for at least for a long time, is actually a footprint showing you that they did walk on land. So people weren't using the right information. So sauropod footprints were known since the early 1900s, but nobody really used that much of an argument of how they would walk around and how they could walk on land. And it turns out they weren't walking like lizards, they were walking just like an elephant or something. Their legs straight underneath them. So the evidence was there for a long time. It just wasn't being used properly. And there's an idea of these sauropods. Dragging its tail, which we know that you don't drag your tail. At least they don't do it very often. So this is a modern idea of the sauropod. It can walk on land very well. So footprints are an aspect of fossil paleontology that a lot of people don't think about. They sort of thought of almost as novelties for a long time. People knew there was dinosaur footprints, but they didn't really try and use them to interpret how these animals could function, how they could walk around, and what they were doing. Sometimes footprints can tell you a lot about what animals are doing. Here's a horseshoe crab from the middle of Jurassic Germany dying at the end of this trail. So you get a real good idea at least what that animal is doing when it died, probably getting in hypersaline lagoons that live there. Other aspects of fossils that show you things are, here's a big fish with a little fish inside, so there's eating that fish, an idea of predation. You can find bite marks on bones and things, sometimes broken teeth, suggesting that animals were scavenging carcasses or maybe killing and eating large animals. Of course, you have coprolites, which don't tell you a lot about specific animals, but it tells you at least that some of them are carnivores, they have bone material in, compared to other ones that have plant material. So you get an idea of things eaten, but it's not a real specific kind of evidence. And then we have ideas about paleogeography. Here we have some Wisconsin dinosaurs to be found, I guess. But if you look at things like how animals or plants are buried, what are the aspects of them that result in fossils being made? And here's just an example of slabs of abundant fish, and you go to Lake Michigan sometimes and see the same sorts of things piling up on shore. So you get an idea of at least how they were fossilized. Sometimes you find at least plants in place, these are roots, so they were fossilized where they were growing, but of course you think these are tree-sized things. I don't think there's ever been a big tree found in complete fossilized. That's likely never happened. So you're looking at the roots, but at least you might give the spacing of these things, how abundant they are. And then these are some Mason Creek things that are real common in the Midwest and around south of Chicago. And using individual fossils, you can reconstruct how these plants work. Sometimes you can find whole groups of animals that are pretty much killed off in place. This is a very famous site in western Nebraska where there's a whole herd of rhinos from babies on up to adults that were all killed related to a big ash fall from the volcanic eruption. So this is, you're seeing the whole group, the whole community pretty much in one place. And this even happens with humans. These are some unfortunate people in Crete that were buried in their house in an earthquake. There's a man known in China, and presumably all their household goods are there. So that's sort of a more recent kind of idea of how organisms are living and how they're killed off and buried catastrophically. So we'll see in the place. So fossils have played this critical role in understanding the history of the Earth and the history of life. One of the most interesting books to read in this regard is this one right here. It tells you how this idea was developed pretty much by a single individual, and all the pleasantries of working in the field of science, people want to believe in things like that. It's a very good book to read. So here's some of the main points of paleontological fossil record demonstrates there are different plants and animals inhabited the Earth at different times. Earth's history can be divided into specific ages based on its characteristic fossils. And as I said before, this is one of the most important discoveries in human knowledge. This is the Grand Canyon, just giving you an idea of how this appears. You'll get different layers of the Grand Canyon. They show you a succession of different plants and animals and environments through time over a vast amount of time. Most places aren't this complex. And you can use these fossils then to reconstruct environments. It's easier when they're closer to the time period we live in. So here we have Ice Age essentially with humans in it. It's much easier to reconstruct that environment than it is to go back farther and farther in time. Okay, so then we're going to do a quick little thing here. We're all going to become paleontologists, so I can show you how paleontologists function. And it's easy to do. All you need is a little knowledge. A lot of paleontologists think only have a little bit of knowledge. But this is the way to do it. So the idea here is I'm going to show you some fossils that some geologists are doing some work on these fossils. They want some information on the age of these rocks and maybe the environment. So we're going to show you how that works with the kinds of fossils. It's not always real straightforward. If you're lucky, you'll get at least one or two things that tell us something very specific. So this is a time scale. You probably can't read it, but it shows that Things like fossil record for invertebrates, lungfish is longer, land plants, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds. So if you find some, say a plant, you know that it occurs just about anywhere along here because plants are pretty much this whole time. If you find a bird, you know that they sort of start here, so that means that the rocks have to be that age or younger as opposed to this age or older. Everybody understand what I'm talking about? So this is a fish, right? So what do we know about fish? What environments do fish live in? Water. Okay. Salt water or fresh water? Well, what about this fish? We're trying to figure out what environment. Andrew?
It looks marine.
That's a good guess. Okay. Time-wise though, what do we know about fish? It's pretty much the whole Paleozoic, right? So they could be almost 600 million years old, any time in there. So it tells you something about the environment, not a lot about the time. Okay, dragonflies find the same beds of these fish. How does that work? What's that?
Buried in water.
Buried in water. No, dragonflies can fly and they can fly and they land in the water.
Freshwater then, wouldn't it be?
That would suggest fresh water, but that's only, it's only where it's buried. So it doesn't mean that it was living there. So it's flying around and it drops in the water. Okay. And that's all I can say. But you're finding it with that fish. So we're talking about a fish and dragonfly, pretty long geologic records for both of those. So, can't blame us. Starfish, what does that think? Salt water. Glad you know this, John. I would expect you. So that tells us, okay, these three fossils we're looking at now, at least they're being preserved in saltwater sediments. So that's important. So we know it's not a freshwater lake at least. Okay. Animals. What does that tell us? Colonial Cretaceous. So it's a pretty long time period. But it does confirm also that it's saltwater because they put it saltwater in the fresh water. Okay, next. Okay, what are these?
Pterosaurs.
Pterosaurs. So they tell us something very specific about time. So they're buried with the fish and all these other animals. They got there probably just like the dragonfly, and they died and fell in the water and washed out the water. But they tell us very specifically something about time, and that is they're from the Mesozoic, so that's from the dinosaurs. So even though we have things that could range much older or more recently, these specific things right here tell us that our fossils are from the Mesozoic. Some of the other fossils tell us they're marine sediments. And so that's what you do with fossils. So we're looking at probably a Jurassic century of fossils. So there's a lot of confusion about dinosaurs and stuff like that. I think we're mature, famous caveman, I guess. So there are these kinds of problems with knowledge, but again, prehistoric animals are very well recognized by the general public, locally, presumably, for sure. And like I said, they show up in the media all the time. People use them to do all kinds of things, worms and put on little celebrations like this, and selling cornflakes and everything. But they're very well known in our society compared to a lot of other aspects of science. You see a lot of stories about termites showing up from baby or something. Okay, anybody have any questions?